What happens when you refuse to be confined or othered? What happens when your voice and your vision are so strong that they can't be contained? Listen to artist and writer Lindsay Adams and curator and gallerist Caitlin Berry discuss this and more. On this episode, I'm joined by Lindsay Adams and director of the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg Center, Caitlin Berry, as we discuss Ceremony, the latest exhibition on view now at the gallery. Listen in as Lindsay shares her insights about her work and practice, while Caitlin tells me about the way that she met Lindsay and how the show has inspired and invigorated her. My name is Lindsay Adams. I'm an artist currently based in Chicago, and I'm very excited to be here to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank Lindsay so much for joining me on an episode of Everything is Connected. You have an exhibition that I'd love for us to speak about. It's on view now through March 7th, Ceremony, on view at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg Center. And Ceremony is a show that contextualizes your work with archival materials, that really investigates Black life and interiority, investigates ideas of travel and movement and place and memory. Can you speak a little bit about the title of the exhibition, Ceremony?
So more often than not, when I'm using and titling either my work or my exhibitions, I'm either looking at writing from scholars that I admire and engage with, or I'm looking at my own writing. Right. So in this case, when it came to titling, and Claudia and I had moments, okay, what have you been reading? What's the most gonna be with? Which is like an integral part of my practice of this note taking and discerning things both emotionally and theoretically. And once we knew that the exhibition was going to engage both my paintings and drawings and some of the archival documents from the special collections library at Johns Hopkins, I had been reading these two essays by Sylvia Winter. Both of them have long titles, but essentially it's The Ceremony Must Be Found, and then the following essay was The Ceremony Found. And when it came to choosing this concept of ceremony, it really was not only fitting for both how we looked at the archival documents of the ways of which Black life had been engaged with leisure and travel and then this coming together with a sense of belonging. It connected directly to the thesis of my own practice, of which I'm considering spatial refusal and taking up space. And I think in many ways, when you think about taking up space and being authentically and sometimes unapologetically who you are, it feels like this communion of innocence, especially when your work is overlapping with others. We've been coming together to embrace our history and embrace the fact that our movement cannot be contained in innocence.
I love that. I wanted to mention one thing, and I've moved myself. Okay. You have a background in cultural anthropology, and I just really want to dig into how that comes through in your practice, how you're investigating that educational background and some of the things that you learned early on in school, and how that is really making its way through your practice.
So I think in many ways, like international studies is a fusion of history, political science, economics, and anthropology. And it's at this nexus of really understanding interconnectedness, right? And I think that has been how I look at most things of wanting to know. I feel like I'm always trying to search for the why of things or how something might be connected to something else. So in the sense of my practice, but it may have gotten cut off when I think about artists being interpreters. We're really looking at everything around us, like what's happening to us and what's happening globally or domestically is not isolated, right? So when you look at these histories that we have lived through and exist through, it's really more connected than it is not. And a part of that is also knowing when to flag something as specific to a Western lens or from the white supremacist infrastructure that we have been forced to exist in, but knowing how to also separate from that and say, oh, we're also existing beyond and outside of that. So when I think about my practice and me being an abstractionist, it's like I'm living and I didn't choose when I was born into the world, right? So I'm living in the world at this time, but I think there's notes, and there definitely are notes of what has happened before or what has happened if we're thinking about Afrofuturism of what has already happened or what will happen. But I think for me, as an artist, as someone who is deeply sensitive to the world, it's important that I engage things from multiple lenses and not just one. I think one, it makes me more effective as a scholar and as an artist, but it also gives this latitude. It gives latitude to both my work in terms of what I am putting out, but also in terms of what the viewer is seeing or experiencing.
In regards to the exhibition ceremony, I know that there are three main themes that the show focuses on, and I just want to pull those up now. So, the idea of travel, both domestic and international, themes of social life and the collective uplift, and then finally, leisure and interiority. Were these three themes something that came out of conversations with the curator? Did you settle on these on your own? How did that come to life and begin to take shape?
Yeah, so Claudia Watts, the curator, is the one that sort of identified those three themes by examining the different layers of the archive. Those concepts were a part of the thesis that I wrote at SAC, was that belonging is not rooted in geographical permanence. I was looking at these three examples of sites, Green Book sites. I was looking at spatial refusal, and then I was looking at artistic interpretation of these concepts. But when I landed on this engagement of belonging, and I was really thinking about the essence of place and placelessness. Like, what does it mean to be in this constant sort of sense of searching and discovery? But despite the fact that some of these sites are now defunct, I looked at historic African American beaches up the East Coast. I looked at Green Book sites. Despite the fact that some of the sites no longer exist, the cultural memory still pertains. So when it comes to the fact that physical places can be fleeting and impermanent, that sense of home or that sense of belonging is not limited to the physical aspect of a place.
Yeah. Your response is making me think about the bodies of work that are under your Where Can I Go to Frolic series, and the idea that one, those works are constrained by 12 inches, and so they're small, very tight. The majority of the work that you create is much larger, right? And so to constrain yourself to these smaller scale works that still have a lot of information in them, that still have a lot of gestural marks, that still have a lot of context to them. Can you speak a little bit about the title, Where Can I Go to Frolic? And also, yeah, just more about these works. I think they're so interesting.
Yeah, so I love this body of work. I've been working on it since I think the fall of 2022. So it's been an ongoing project. Most of them are 12 by 12. A few of them are a little bigger, but so it started off as I wrote a short form essay asking this question of where can I go to farm? And the question came out of this desire and this yearning to be free, to be able to operate in my own agency and be able to move without, we can never move without consent, but to be able to move with a level of freedom and expressiveness that's not contained. I definitely believe in frolicking. I believe in the ability to be whimsical at times, but I also don't equate frolicking to something that's flippant or unintentional. I think it's this radical act of saying, I refuse to be defined to be contained and to be controlled. And because we're operating within oppressive systems, that is something that you have to consciously and constantly do, even when everything else about the world is telling you that is not available. So the question of where can I go to frolic is both poetic and political, right? Because I said something about frolicking and movement and dance. And it could be any or all of those things. Or it could be a sense of stubbornness of saying, I'm not going to take on the woes and the weight of the world today. I'm just going to exist in my own ethereal space. But also, I'm aware of the fact that I am a Black and disabled woman and my physical body. So there are actual constraints and limitations that I have to navigate constantly in the best of ways and in the worst of ways, right? So that's where the politics of it all is. For all intents and purposes, the world has told me that I should not be frolicking or that I cannot frolic. And I think that 12 by 12 scale is not only for everyone who engages in painting with a capital P, scale and size can have a sort of a presence and a tone. Because I know that I'm also working at 14 feet and 6 feet and 7 feet, by me taking on a 12, I have said throughout critique, to make a strong 12 by 12 painting is way harder than you would expect, right? Because you need it to carry and you need it to hold. And even though scale and size are not synonymous, I don't believe that like a 12 by 12 in scale can still be perceived as prominent and taking up and holding space. So when I think about those 12 by 12s, not when I started doing them before I titled the work, they really were a way of me to just freely express my mark. I was learning and unpacking my mark making and my layering at a scale that was just 1 foot by 1 foot. It's like a vinyl. I don't even know, but I think vinyls are bigger than 12 by 12. I also feel like at that scale, I just wrote in my moleskin the other day, there's a confidence of I'm now bigger than this frame, right? So I'm looking at my marks differently. They're moving differently, and then I'm now translating some of those marks and applying that to the bigger works. So it's both a formal, I think it's a formal decision and a conceptual decision to say, like, we used to say, a few friends of mine used to say in grad school, when you make a small painting that way, you're forcing the view to look different. You're forcing the viewer to look differently. So it's like, let me teach you how to see because I'm making you come closer. I'm making you focus on a scale that is not even the size of our heads.
I think that's just such an interesting reflection that you're really engaging the viewer in a different way when you're thinking about scale, when you're thinking about the use of material and you're thinking about the use of color. And I think that the fact that you make your paintings with layers and layers of color is also something that adds such a depth and richness to the work.
Yeah.
As we pivot a little, I want to ask a bit about, and we talked about this earlier in the episode, but just the notion of your work being presented in conversation with archives. Is this the first time that has happened? And in general, how do you feel about that? How do you perceive that? And do you think that working with archives is something that you want to continue to do at different points in your career and in your practice?
Yeah. So this is the first time that my work has been shown with the archive, but not my first time engaging with the archive, if that makes sense. So I think the fact that it was able to manifest in this sort of literal and visual way is definitely something I want to continue to explore. I have began visiting sites on the Green Book and I have been documenting those sites with film photography and taking notes in my notebooks about what I was interpreting from the spaces. And when it comes to looking at memory and place, I'm obviously always looking back into either whether it be poetry or literature. So to see it now materialize in a way of the archive is sitting next to my painting, and it's I appreciate that the statement of it is not because I'm not pulling in those imagery directly. I think going back to the title, it requires a moment of pause because, like, my abstraction is a present and living archive of many of the same emotionality and sentiment that is existing in these letters or these photos. It's like they're saying the same thing in a different visual language. And I really appreciate the rigor behind that of pausing and really forcing both me as the maker and the viewer to think a little differently in that sense. It's not one for one, but it does engage in this moment of reinterpreting.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Like you can have a different conversation with the work because now the archive is in dialogue with the work. And so you can think about the work very differently. And I love that consideration for the viewer. Thank you so much, Lindsay Adams, for joining me on an episode of Everything is Connected. And now we'll take a moment to chat with Caitlin Berry.
I'm Caitlin Berry. I'm the director of the Irene and Richard Frary Gallery at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg Center.
Caitlin, thank you so much for joining me on an episode of Everything is Connected. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you today. We have the pleasure of being able to discuss an exhibition that you have on view now, Ceremony, which features newly created works by Lindsay Adams in conversation with archival materials and never before seen ephemera and objects from the center's library.
Yes, from the Johns Hopkins University Sheridan Libraries, specifically our special collections. That's right.
So how about we just jump right in and talk a little bit about the current exhibition, and then we can take some time and talk about some of the dedicated initiatives and arts initiatives that you have, such as the Sam Gilliam Lecture Series. But if we dial it back, yeah, let's talk a little bit about Lindsay Adams' show, Ceremony, and how it came to life.
Thank you so much for having me, Sade. It's such a pleasure. Lindsay is someone who we've been orbiting each other for several years now, and I became aware of her work in a more intimate way via the exhibition that our exhibition's curator, Claudia Watts, actually curated for Eaton House several years ago. And it was such a landmark in so many ways and garnered such joy and positivity from this community. And I think really put Lindsay on the map as someone who had a unique voice and vision in her work. And I think we probably started talking to each other on Instagram and had heard of each other through our different connections. And eventually we met for coffee, and it became evident from the moment we started talking to each other that Lindsay really is so self-possessed and sure of herself in the world and is able to articulate that in paint in a way that is rare, unique. And she has this gravitational pull around her that is so warm. And I was so grateful to have the opportunity to meet her in this way. And then our friendship and dialogue grew over the years, and we would check in with each other every now and then. And whenever I began in this role in the fall of 2024 at the Frary Gallery and with Johns Hopkins, understanding that sort of mission of the gallery is to encourage dialogue around art and democracy and celebrate the rich tapestry of viewpoints and traditions that are present in the world. And thinking about Lindsay and her background in international relations and diplomacy, it was just the perfect fit to think about an exhibition with her. And we had a few chats about who could be the right curator for this show. And Lindsay is an academic and researches extensively and is a voracious reader, great appreciator of poetry and film and media. And so her sort of primary source material is vast and varied. And I think for this reason, she understood the potential for dialogue and scholarship in placing her work in dialogue with these rich archival materials that we steward in our libraries. And so Claudia Watts, the curator of this exhibition, the guest curator, has the right sensibility vision to be able to marry those two things together. And so we met and we're off to the races. And it's been a great pleasure of my life to be able to work with Lindsay on this show.
I love the generosity of your response and just the nuances and the layers of different things that you shared. And I always find that when I do this kind of work, when I'm talking to people on my show, that, a response elicits so many questions, right? You can only ask one after someone has said something, but you're not sure which one you want to ask. But I think the thing that comes up for me, which I think is really poignant in this period, is, I think it really hones in on why so many people are drawn to the arts and what draws people to the arts. But you talked about the sliding in the DMs and talking about building a relationship and building a rapport with Lindsay over time and developing a relationship over a period. Can you find that in your experience, many projects and many things that you put together, many initiatives that you work on, are generally with relationships that are built slowly over time? And can you speak a little bit more about your thoughts around that and why that's important?
A resounding yes from me that, many of these relationships and opportunities and programs begin, the conversations around them begin long before they actually happen. And I'm actually going to reference the great Sarah Lewis, who was our inaugural speaker in the Sam Gilliam lecture series that launched last spring. And she so beautifully commented that we can't always be in harvest time, that sometimes we are in seed planting time. And it was just such a beautiful way to frame the ebbs and flows of time, of culture, of social change. And so I think that can be mapped onto relationships and how they're built over time and how seeds can be planted in so many different ways. And with the right kind of nutrients and water and care, they can germinate into these really beautiful things. And so, some exhibitions that I've worked on in the past couple of years have been in my mind for 10. And I think that many curators and arts administrators would answer in a similar fashion.
You for sharing that and expanding on that. And I think that's a perfect segue to talk a little bit about the Sam Gilliam lecture series. So Sarah Lewis was the first speaker, the Astor Gates followed shortly after, and I know that there will be more speakers announced this year. Can we dial it back a little and talk about how that lecture series has come to life? What were some of the early conversations, and what was it like when you were talking to, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Sam Gilliam estate, right? Or the people who run the estate. Yeah, what were those early conversations like before you landed on the lecture series?
I have to give credit where credit is due, and that is largely to the vision of Nancy Rosen, who was the curator and art advisor for the four public commissions inside the Hopkins Bloomberg Center. She, alongside a committee, was able to visually manifest so many programmatic ideals about this space in terms of weaving this dialogue between the local and the global. So we commissioned work from Sandra Sinto, Pakistani American artist, Shazia Sikander, Ethiopian artist Elias Simei, and our hometown hero, Sam Gilliam. We had the wonderful opportunity to work with him and his foundation, and this painting that is such an anchor point for the building was one of the last paintings he ever made before he passed away. And so that relationship with the foundation and with Annie Gawlak grew because I think they were able to come see the power of this place as a convener for conversations that can be had uniquely here with the benefit of the vast array of expertise at Johns Hopkins. And we're able to invite somebody like Sarah Lewis to be in dialogue with Leah Wright Rigor, who's an incredible, powerful force in her own right. And in Theaster's case, to be in dialogue with Lawrence Jackson, who is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor here and also the director of the Billie Holiday Center for Liberation Arts. And we're able to provide this beautiful container where art has become integral, not only architecturally, but programmatically for these important and dynamic conversations. And I think Annie and the foundation understood and appreciated that those conversations would be unique to this setting and that we could appropriately and enthusiastically further Sam's legacy in that way. Sam was committed to challenging the status quo. And I think that you see that in his incredible innovations around physically removing the canvas from the stretcher in the late 60s and early 70s when we talk about his draped paintings. And that kind of pushing and innovation and discovery is exactly what we are about at Johns Hopkins. The discoveries that have happened here across disciplines, science, public health, tech, innovation, whatever it is, they advance the quality of life for those in the world. And I think the same is true of art. So that's my sort of long poetic way of describing how this relationship came to be. So far, our two speakers, and looking toward 2026, we're excited to announce more very soon. So stay tuned for that. And we want to continue to be able to have these conversations here and invite people in to be a part of that community.
Yeah, that's just such important and good work. Doing the good work that needs to be done in the world must also feel very good as well. And I think you speaking about Sam and being boundary pushing, interestingly enough, made me think a lot about Lindsay, right? Because you spoke about an artist who is so self-possessed, who's so self-assured, who has this sort of inner understanding of who she is in the world, right? And what the world tells her she is versus what she knows to be herself. And I think that is also very important and a commanding space to be. I want to toggle back to something you said earlier. You chose the word democracy in one of your responses, and I think I immediately thought about where we are in the country right now, where we are in society at large. And I was thinking about the protests like BLM and 2020 and the summer of COVID. And I was in New York at that time. And I remember that period being a moment where I was really struck by some of the protesting chants where people would say, "Tell me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like." And that would be the call and response. And I think, what does a democracy look like today? What does it look like in America today is something that's actively being reshaped, reformed, contested, reimagined, under attack. And so it does feel like the work feels, and I use the word urgent all the time because I think there are so many things that are truly pressing. But what feels for you, if we hone back in on the mission, what feels for you very urgent, very pressing, very necessary, and needed in the work that you do?
Gosh, what a great question. I am a consumer of creativity across disciplines. I love to read, watch movies, fashion shows, really celebrate creative people because they are so reflective of the moment that we live in. And actually, just a couple of days ago, if not yesterday, Marc Jacobs launched his 2026 spring collection. And there was a line from the sort of description of the show that I was like, wow, this is so tied into what we're trying to convey in this exhibition. And I think is true of Lindsay to a degree, but, and I may get part of this wrong, but it was something like recovering the past reminds us that loss is inevitable and hope is work. And it just struck me, this conversation between memory and hope. And like for me, Lindsay's paintings are such clear bells of hope and resilience, and at times are tinged with this like foggy melancholy of memory. And to achieve that takes an enormous amount of work and a focus and drive. And remembering can be painful, but it can be healing. And, what I think Claudia Watts, the curator of the exhibition, has done so beautifully is create this space for memory and imagination with these archival anchors of the past. And that work around creating space for these conversations feels the most urgent for me.
I love that. Yeah, no, we've got it. Thank you so much. That was really a beautiful
All
response.
right.
It hones in again on the why, right? It hones in on why does one continue to pursue a thing, right? And when you articulate it that way and just say it back to me that way, it's really poignant. And I love the reflection of these other worlds of creativity that we often may look at as completely separate, but they truly are very much
Yeah.
intertwined. People say fashion is political because what you wear is a statement, right? How you dress, how you move through the world, how you embroider and don yourself is a statement about what you believe in to a degree. It can be. And
That's
so
exactly right.
I love that you brought that up.
Thanks. It is all related. And I was having this conversation with some colleagues the other day about the sort of iconic quote in The Devil Wears Prada, where she's talking about the color cerulean and the sweater, and this was chosen for you. And so much of culture is so interconnected. Everything is connected. And to imagine that they could exist in silos just it doesn't compute for me. I think we're much more connected than maybe any of us even imagine.
We've just ended this episode on a wonderful and beautiful high note. Caitlin Berry, thank you so much for joining me on an episode of Everything is Connected. That was my episode with Lindsay Adams and Caitlin Berry. If you enjoyed this episode, consider supporting our work by becoming a subscriber. When you subscribe to Lightwork, you support the work of contemporary artists and the insightful and impactful conversations that I have with them as we investigate art, culture, and society. You support a female founder and a woman-led business. You support Black entrepreneurship at a time when our government and private corporations continue to eradicate DEI efforts. Subscribe to our Substack and you'll receive exclusive information and resources about each episode, behind-the-scenes content, and more. And remember, follow Lightwork across social platforms for more insights into the inner world of contemporary artists and thought leaders shaping culture.